Nikola Tesla, the famed genius inventor, sits alone in a dimly lit hotel room at the New Yorker Hotel, surrounded not by revolutionary machines, but by piles of unpaid bills and rejection letters from potential investors. It's 1943, and the man once hailed as electricity's prophet is now feeding pigeons with his last dollars, mumbling incoherently about death rays and communication with Mars. His gaunt face illuminated by the flickering bulb ironically powered by his rival Edison's direct current system reveals a man consumed not by scientific brilliance, but by delusions and paranoia. This isn't the Tesla of modern internet worship, the wronged genius robbed of recognition. This is Tesla as he actually died, broke, mentally unstable, and with the vast majority of his world-changing inventions existing only in his increasingly disconnected imagination. The cult of Tesla wasn't born from scientific achievement, it was manufactured from failure. You felt that jolt in the opening scene, the lonely room, the pigeons, the flicker of a bulb. That image does not appear in the tidy, polished story most people know. Now we're going to set aside the hotel room final act and rehearse the version everyone learned. The victory lap, the moral simplicity, the icon framed in museum light. This is the official Tesla, the comforting myth that fits neatly into textbooks, motivational posters, and sleek marketing campaigns. The official story begins with a young immigrant arriving in the United States with little more than brilliance and ambition. In classrooms and pop documentaries, he appears as a solitary Prometheus, an outsider with an idea so pure it could remake the world. The films show him sketching coils and motors by lamplight, standing beside a prototype that glows like a revelation. He doesn't ask for much. The narration says only fairness and a chance. In the tidy version, Tesla wrestles with the era's industrial titans, and, despite sabotage and theft, his core ideas, alternating current, wireless transmission, and a host of other inventions loom as obvious forerunners of the modern age. Listen to how the official voice sounds: calm, righteous, and moral. He invented alternating current, the textbooks declare. He was cheated by Edison. Marconi stole radio from him. Wardenclyffe was the promise of free energy suppressed by greedy bankers. These lines are short, clean, and satisfying. They give you a villain, an underdog, and an unambiguous moral resolution. The genius was wronged. The myth works on a cinematic script. We see early triumphs, dramatic demonstrations of motors and lighting, press photos with glowing bulbs, and a brooding rivalry with Edison framed as moral theater. Edison becomes the crude antagonist, loud, commercial, profit-driven, while Tesla is the silent, incorruptible genius who slips away from fame only to be betrayed. The Wardenclyffe Tower is the perfect symbol in this account. A single monolithic promise of free, wireless power for all, dismantled in shadowy rooms where men in suits count profits instead of futures. This version prospers because it simplifies a messy human life into a parable we can use. It satisfies three cravings at once. First, it answers our hunger for a single heroic author of massive change, one mind responsible for a century's progress. Second, it validates suspicion of institutions. Corporations didn't merely compete, they conspired. Third, it comforts environmental and tech activists with a story that says the solution already exists and was hidden. Those cravings are not trivial. They are emotional shortcuts that turn complex debates about energy and power into a story we can feel on our knees. In classrooms, the narrative is polished further. Dates are arranged into a clean arc: arrival in the U.S., early patents, the Westinghouse connection, the public theater of the War of the Currents, then the fall Wardenclyffe, Marconi, bankruptcy, and finally the lonely retirement. Each scene is staged to guide sympathy. The nuance drops away. Difficult technical counterarguments, the collaborative nature of engineering, the limitations of period materials, these details are either glossed over or retold as inconvenient footnotes. Here are the canonical sound bites the myth uses like an incantation. He lit a bulb wirelessly, a line repeated in TED Talks and pop videos, as if that single act proves prophetic omniscience. Edison suppressed AC, another phrase that condenses messy market competition into a moral crime. J.P. Morgan betrayed him, a line that transforms a complicated patronage relationship into a melodrama of villainy. The repetition makes the myth sticky. It becomes frictionless to say and emotionally satisfying to hear. Who benefits from a tidy, heroic Tesla? Quite a few groups, and in different ways. Nationalists in Tesla's ancestral lands found a symbol to claim, a native son who bested industrialized West. Counterculture movements and New Age circles picked up his later eccentric claims ether, telepathy, death rays, and repackaged them as suppressed truths. Tech entrepreneurs saw in him a romantic predecessor, a brilliant outsider fighting entrenched systems. Even consumer brands discovered the marketability of the image. Tesla's name and visage sell everything from luxury cars to artisan coffee mugs. This is how myth becomes commodity. The image on a t-shirt doesn't ask whether a claimed invention worked. It asks whether you want to belong to a tribe that believes in the persecuted genius. The internet then accelerates the process. Clips, GIFs, and quotable lines detach from context and travel across platforms. A 30-second montage of Tesla's career, breathlessly narrated, is more contagious than a 3-hour academic lecture. Emotion gets distilled into a meme. At its best, the official story performs a civic function. It reminds us that innovation sometimes challenges entrenched power. At its worst, it flattens history into a morality play and substitutes desire for evidence. The neat villain of capitalist suppression feels righteous, but it obscures a crucial fact. Most successful technologies, especially those that scale widely, are not the products of single solitary geniuses, but of teams, standards, manufacturing, and markets. AC power became ubiquitous not because one person discovered it and the rest conspired to hide it, but because engineers figured out how to manufacture, distribute, and maintain reliable systems at scale. There are visual cues the mythology loves to use because they resonate emotionally. Picture, for a moment, the cinematic Wardenclyffe, a skeletal tower rising out of a windswept Long Island lot, cables invisible as a promise. The myth amplifies that image into an emblem of lost possibility. But the real Wardenclyffe, when examined closely, looks different, an ambitious but unfinished project with engineering challenges and escalating costs. The emotional image is more powerful than the inconvenient technicalities. Now, listen, you already know this comfortable version. You've probably seen it in videos, social posts, or a museum caption. It makes you feel something: admiration, outrage, sorrow. But there's a risk in revering an incomplete story. When we turn a complicated life into a simple fable, we hand off our critical capacity. We stop asking which parts are firm facts, which are interpretations, and which are after-the-fact edits that serve modern interests. We're about to pull the thread that unravels the tidy sweater. We will turn to documents, court records, engineering reports, and the messy letters people wrote at the time. We will look at what invited funding, what scared investors, and what really existed at Wardenclyffe. If the official story wants to stand up to scrutiny, it must survive those questions. Before we move on, a quick note. Thank you for watching this investigation this far. This channel is new and trying to do something risky: ask uncomfortable historical questions. If this investigation matters to you, subscribing helps us make more episodes like this and reach 1,000 supporters who want history without the PR gloss. Join the effort and help us keep digging. Mini cliffhanger. The tidy story gives you a hero and a villain. But when you open the archives, you find letters that don't match the emotional script, and one of those letters hints at a private plan Tesla never disclosed to his funders. Hold that thought. The first early AC installations were indeed dangerous by modern standards. Insulation and grounding practices were immature, and high-voltage mishaps were real hazards in a rapidly electrifying world. When you read technical reports from the 1880s and 1890s, engineers debate safety and standards in ways that are far more nuanced than the modern good versus evil narrative suggests. Then there is the radio dispute, which folklore compresses into a theft story. Marconi stole radio from Tesla. The headline version of this episode is emotionally irresistible and has a legal anchor. Decades after both men had died, the United States Supreme Court did restore certain claims to Tesla's patents. But the decision was narrow and technical. It did not produce a sweeping moral verdict that Tesla had been robbed. Marconi's work involved original engineering choices and practical demonstrations that eventually made radio a working, commercial technology. The courtroom footnotes make the simple "Marconi stole the radio" line much less certain than viral posts imply. Now think about the record of Tesla's later years. The phase the myth tends to romanticize as ahead of his time. After roughly 1900, the historical record changes tone. Tesla continued to appear in newspapers, but his claims shifted from engineering results to grand pronouncements. He promised a death ray and announced devices that could communicate with Mars, thought photography, and wireless power that would bathe entire continents. He wrote and lectured prolifically, but his notebooks from that era, when examined by historians, show less disciplined experiment design and more scattered, speculative ideas. This pattern raises a question you should hear plainly. What differentiates visionary insight from hopeful fantasy? A key component is demonstrability. The hallmark of mature science is not merely the idea, but the evidence, a reproducible experiment, published results, peer validation. For much of his later career, Tesla offered words, drawings, and public statements rather than working prototypes. That difference gradually eroded his credibility with institutional science and with cautious investors. The Wardenclyffe episode reveals the collision of charisma, ambition, and practical reality. J.P. Morgan provided significant initial funding, but he was a banker, not a philanthropist with endless pockets. Cost estimates rose. Deadlines slipped. Tesla's private letters, when put beside public promises, show a widening gulf. To the public, he framed Wardenclyffe as a world-changing communications hub. To some funders, he hinted at wireless power, a concept that would have required solving energy dissipation problems and dealing with issues physicists already flagged as intractable with contemporary knowledge. When Morgan discovered that the project's public description and Tesla's private pitch were not perfectly aligned, his patience thinned. Later that same year, Guglielmo Marconi achieved transatlantic radio communication using systems that were less grandiose but functionally sound. Investors, whose primary concern was returns, or at least professional credibility, grew wary. Wardenclyffe was not merely a casualty of corporate suppression. It collapsed under a mix of misaligned expectations, flawed technical assumptions, and normal investment risk. The most telling evidence is not mythic speeches or dramatic photographs. It is the accounting. Ledgers and contractor invoices show mounting debts and work that did not deliver the advertised results. The tower, majestic in silhouette, stood incomplete and costly. In 1917, it was razed for scrap. That physical demolition is an emblem of failure, but it does not, by itself, prove malfeasance or suppression. It proves engineering and financial collapse. Tesla's personal habits and psychology intersected with these failures in ways often left out of the public story. His obsessive routines and phobias are frequently rendered as charming eccentricities in popular portrayals. But personal letters and contemporaneous accounts indicate compulsions that interfered with project management and collaboration. Reports of hallucinations and sensory fixations recorded by caregivers and journalists hint at deteriorating mental health that would affect judgment and the capacity to shepherd a complex, multidisciplinary undertaking like Wardenclyffe. And yet Tesla did not vanish into oblivion at once. He continued to attract press attention because he had cultivated a public persona, confident, theatrical, and relentlessly quotable. The same trait that helped him secure patrons in earlier decades, his flair for dramatic demonstrations and grand statements, kept him visible even when the substance faded. Newspapers loved spectacle. They loved a man who could promise the impossible with a straight face. The media ecosystem of the time rewarded the sensational, not the technically boring paragraphs of engineering validation. So why did the myth survive and mutate into the version we know today? Part of the answer lies in posthumous storytelling choices. Some biographers and popular writers preferred the romantic arc of the misunderstood genius. It sells better than a technical manuscript about patent law and manufacturing scale. Others had national or political motives. Elevating Tesla as a symbol of a nation's genius serves identity politics. In the 1960s and 70s, counterculture movements seized on Tesla as an emblem of alternative science, his late-life eccentricities read as suppressed truths. Later, the internet amplified these echoes, detaching claims from their archival contexts. Another mechanism was selective citation. Writers eager to defend Tesla would quote his most visionary statements without noting the lack of experimental validation. Opponents would point to the failures and dismiss him as a crank. Both tactics are intellectually lazy. One romanticizes anomalies, the other simplifies tragedy into caricature. The deeper problem is cognitive. We love origin myths. We prefer stories that assign credit neatly. It helps us feel that progress is simple and heroes are pure. But technology rarely advances like a single arrow shot by one archer. It advances as a braided path, with many hands, small improvements, policy choices, and market failures along the way. When you substitute an origin myth for that braided reality, you not only misread the past, you distort how you think progress happens in the future. By now you should sense the fracture lines. Technical precedents distributed across many actors. Messy patent litigation that only partially vindicated claims. An expensive, overambitious project rooted in flawed scientific assumptions and managerial shortfalls, and an individual whose psychological struggles complexified his later years. All of these facts sit uneasily under the myth. Each one by itself might be a footnote. Together they form an inconvenient truth. Tesla was brilliant, yes, and he made real contributions. But the galvanizing cult around him leans heavily on selective memory. Mini cliffhanger. The cracks we've opened here are not just historical clarifications. They are the fault lines along which a much larger cultural phenomenon spreads the tendency to treat rejection by experts as proof of persecution. If Tesla's later failures can be reinterpreted as martyrdom, what happens to every modern inventor who claims the same fate? We will follow that trace next, and it is not flattering. Behind the public polish there is a different, quieter theater. Velvet curtains, private tables, ledger books. Picture a young Nikola in a tailor's shop, insisting on linen that never creases, a man who understood that spectacle bought attention. He kept his hair immaculate, his clothes immaculate, and a string of favorite restaurants where waiters knew which seat he preferred. It is easy to imagine him exiting a West 23rd Street door into gaslight, a cigarette case flashing under his palm, and an editor already waiting with a notebook. That neat image sits uneasily beside the solitary genius the myth prefers. Tesla knew how to turn a room into a stage. He cultivated press friendships like other men collected tools, not merely for flattery, but because headlines translated into investors. He was generous with quotes and dramatic demonstrations, timing his pronouncements for the slow news weeks and the bored society pages. When success was hot, small crowds swarmed. When budgets tightened, he kept the stories alive. He learned early that narrative, a hint of the miraculous, a gesture of humility, could do what a grant application rarely did. That speed produced brilliant flashes, yes, and also a string of incomplete projects. In the lab, this looks like restless creativity. In the accounting room, it looks like missed deliverables. His private habits layered onto the professional problems. Obsessive rituals counting steps, avoiding certain textures, and almost ceremonial cleanliness bled into timelines. Meetings were missed because a jacket was not precisely arranged. Correspondents report that Tesla could be dazzling in conversation and then suddenly withdrawn, irritated by interruptions he perceived as slights. The behaviors that made him memorable also made him unreliable by financier standards. He was a genius, but he was also, in the words of a contemporary aide, a storm that needs taming. Those storms cost him trust. There were also episodes that suggest mental cracks wider than eccentricity. Periodic reports of hallucinations and sensory overload appear in private notes and third-party recollections. At times he described seeing intricate machinery in light before any prototype existed. At others he insisted on technologies that contradicted physics as understood then. Peers who worked with him in the 1890s remember a man whose intuition could be blindingly right and, weeks later, alarmingly untethered from measurable results. When scientific journals stopped accepting his submissions, he did not retire from thought. He retreated into press releases and public pronouncements. The pattern becomes clear. Presentation and promise replaced peer-reviewed proof. Where colleagues documented experiments with tables and replication steps, Tesla offered evocative language and grand claims. He would give a public lecture promising devices to come, and his audience, hungry for wonder, applauded. Investors, at first complicit in that applause, eventually required deliverables. The gap between spectacle and reproducible engineering is where Wardenclyffe would stumble. And soon enough, the same flair that won him rooms at Delmonico's would leave him with unpaid bills and an unfinished tower. The machinery of charisma that built Tesla up was the very mechanism that would help dismantle him. The next scene is one of the few where private letters meet public failure. A banker's pen refusing another check. But before that arrival, there are whispered accusations, misaligned expectations, and a discovery that the project on paper differs from the one being sold to funders. Hold that moment, the patient, procedural collapse, because it will explain everything that came after. There is a sound you can imagine before Wardenclyffe falls. The creak of scaffolding, the clink of invoices, the low murmur of men calculating days until payroll. In spring 1901, the lot on Shoreham, Long Island felt like a stage set for a global promise. The tower rose in skeletal silhouette against the salt air, and Tesla walked it like a preacher on a pulpit, proclaiming a world system that would carry messages and, eventually, power across oceans. Public ceremonies and photographs fixed the image, a solitary mast and a man pointing toward the horizon. But what the photos cannot show is the private stream of memos and cables that tell a different story. Cost overruns, hurried purchases, and technical notes from engineers whose caution was politely phrased and damning in effect. You were told the tower was about wireless communication. That was the official, bankable pitch. The letters that survive whisper another intention. In correspondence to select patrons, Tesla suggested far grander ambitions: the transmission of electrical energy without wires, power beamed across distances to light continents. He framed it as practical, imminent, inevitable. But the physics textbooks of the time and the engineers who kept returning polite yet insistent replies flagged fundamental problems. Power dissipates. Ground wave transmission requires enormous power. Losses scale with distance. Those are not bureaucratic objections. They are constraints that define what an idea can or cannot do in real hardware. The project accelerated anyway. Orders were placed, contractors hired, a laboratory built. Contractors kept ledgers, nails, timber, copper, and timesheets. They also recorded delays. Key tests, the sort that would prove a concept to a skeptical engineer, were either postponed or never completed in ways that satisfied funders. Tesla was prone to announcing results before apparatuses were refined. Press releases trumped lab notes. That mismatch matters. Investors fund results. Visionaries promise them. J.P. Morgan, whose support was never unconditional charity, began to ask the questions that reveal intent. Is this a communication tower or an experiment in global power transmission? When Morgan discovered the private language in Tesla's letters, his appetite for risk cooled. The moment of rupture was not a headline, but a ledger entry, a letter from Morgan declining further funds. The public narrative spun a melodrama of betrayal. In private, the banker cited mismatched plans and missing milestones. Soon after, a rival Guglielmo Marconi sent a radio signal across the Atlantic with a system far simpler and engineered for real-world reliability. That success crystallized the practical path the industry took. Incremental, reproducible improvements rather than sweeping redesigns of physical law. Wardenclyffe's promise, by contrast, remained a promise on paper. The tower became an unfinished monument. By 1905, the site quieted, materials stood idle, and bills mounted. In 1917, the structure was razed for scrap, a physical demolition that served as a final punctuation mark. The image of the torn-down tower is cinematic. Workers with crowbars, piles of twisted metal, a rusted emblem of failed transcendence. For Tesla, it meant one thing above all. The last serious chance at large-scale patronage evaporated. Men in suits moved their marks. Editorial pages moved on. For the public myth-makers, it became evidence of suppression. For historians of technology, it became an object lesson in what separates feasible engineering from wishful thinking. The fallout reached deeper than finances. Wardenclyffe severed a thread of credibility. Edison's caricature as the villain became easier to sell, but engineers and institutions that once indulged Tesla's eccentric genius now cataloged a pattern. Brilliant early work followed by increasing claims unsupported by reproducible results. He had once been a partner to industry. Now he was a cautionary anecdote. Socially, his peers gave him distance. Financially, he oscillated between small gifts and rejection. Psychologically, the man who had once dazzled rooms now spent his capital of trust. Yet even in ruin, Tesla remained theatrically public. He fed the press with new, larger claims, a death ray, contact with Mars and the papers. Hungry for copy, obliged. That behavior ensured his name lived on, but it also sealed a narrative shift. The public remembered the spectacle. The professional community cataloged the failures. The crucial point is this: Wardenclyffe did not fail primarily because of corporate conspiracy. It failed because it rested on a set of technical assumptions that contemporary science and engineering judged impractical, and because project management and fundraising were misaligned with demonstrable milestones. Look closer at the scrap heap and you see the anatomy of a career's pivot: persuasive public performance, private overreach, and a costly mismatch between promise and provable function. That anatomy created the raw material for later stories that would either sanctify or demonize Tesla, depending on who held the microphone. The dismantling of Wardenclyffe is the hinge on which his posthumous myth swings. The rest of his life and the later resurrection of his image are readable only through the wreckage of that failed tower. And there is one more uncomfortable fact among the ruins. The technical community that examined his notes did not find evidence of a hidden, functioning global power system. They found ambitious speculation and incomplete experiments. That is a quieter truth than conspiracy, but it is the one that actually explains why Wardenclyffe closed. Keep that in mind. It will matter when the story returns to public memory, repackaged and polished. A myth needs narrators. After Tesla died in 1943, narrators multiplied and voices changed tone. In Belgrade, a newly assertive Yugoslav state found in Tesla a symbol useful for nation building. A native genius who belonged on conspiracy-minded audiences found in Tesla an archetype that fit neatly into existing frameworks: a persecuted genius, a suppressed technology, a secret buried by profit. The story spread because it satisfied an appetite for moral simplicity. Who benefits? Many groups, and in different ways. Nationalists secure cultural prestige. Counterculture and New Age movements find a martyr for alternative science. Tech entrepreneurs can borrow a heroic ancestor for their own brand narratives. If you are disrupting industry, invoke Tesla and inherit his mythic righteousness. And commercial interests, filmmakers, merchandisers, tourist boards monetize the romance. Each recasting strips nuance and amplifies selective truths. The myth becomes a commodity. The mechanism of manufacture is simple and ruthless. Select a few vivid facts, omit bothersome details, and repeat. A phrase becomes a slogan. He lit a bulb wirelessly, compresses into an emblem that stands for genius beyond reproach. Edison suppressed him, becomes shorthand for corporate evil across hundreds of contexts. Repetition buries complexity. Over decades, museums and textbooks mirror the popular account, and the lie hardens into a version that feels comfortable and complete. But there were quieter forces at work, too. Biographies written with devotion rather than critical distance. Editorial choices that preferred drama to nuance. And later, entrepreneurs who found in Tesla a marketing myth that conferred romantic legitimacy on their ventures. A clean, wrong genius is a powerful brand asset. The cultural industry polished Tesla into an asset. The internet supercharged the effect, fragmenting authority while amplifying the memorable. Forums, YouTube channels, and blogs recycled the most sensational claims and stripped them of context. Wild speculation spread beside archival photographs, each pair lending the other credibility in the eyes of those seeking validation. Once a myth achieves that velocity, it becomes self-sustaining. Communities form around it. Devout believers guard it against correction. Contrarian evidence is framed as more proof of persecution. Yet historians and engineers who read the original notebooks see a different man. A gifted early career, followed by speculative later years where claims outpaced demonstrable results. That version lacks the drama of suppression, but contains the harder lessons about how science and technology actually progress by iteration, standards, and coordinated manufacturing, not by single heroic strokes. When the myth becomes the dominant cultural memory, it warps how people evaluate new claims today. "I'm the next Tesla" becomes a rhetorical shield for inventors who resist peer review. Rejection by experts morphs into proof of persecution rather than a prompt for better evidence. So the fabrication of Tesla's modern cult was not a single conspiracy, but a long process of selection, amplification, and cultural repurposing. Each actor, state institutions, countercultural movements, writers, entrepreneurs, and online communities played a role. The result is a recycled myth that serves contemporary needs more than it reflects historical complexity. After decades of polishing and propagation, what remains? An icon that simplifies technological history into moral drama. A symbol people reach for when they want to believe in the purity of genius or the malevolence of industry. It is useful, comforting, and often misleading. The final uncomfortable thought is this: myths are not neutral. They shape expectations, funding choices, and public trust in experts. When the myth tells us a problem was solved long ago and simply suppressed, it quietly redirects attention and resources away from the hard, incremental work that solves real problems. The machine that manufactured Tesla's myth turned a flawed human into a mirror for cultures to project onto. And because myths are sticky, the work of correction is slow. But correction matters. It changes how we listen to claims today and how we decide what to fund tomorrow. The next time someone tells you they are the real Tesla, Ask what evidence they have, and who benefits if their story replaces arduous proof with a tidy moral. That question opens another file, and this investigation is far from over. A more honest portrait of Nikola Tesla begins, not with hagiography or caricature, but with a room, a cluttered workshop in lower Manhattan where glass, copper, and a smell of ozone meet the precise hand of a man who could see machines in his head. In that room, at the height of his powers, Tesla produced things that mattered. The polyphase induction motor and several related alternating current devices were not fairy tales. They were practical, engineered pieces of technology that solved real problems for factories and cities. When a machine spun and factories lit, that was not imagination, it was engineering. Those successes are the foundation on which any fair appraisal must rest. But even at the peak, Tesla worked differently from most of his peers. He prized visualization and thought experiment over heavy mathematics. He pictured fields, sparks and currents as if composing music. That way of working produced flashes of insight. It also produced blind spots. Without the steady scaffolding of formal analysis and painstaking incremental testing, some ideas stayed brilliant in description and fragile in reality. He could conceive an elegant stroke in the air and then struggle to turn it into repeatable hardware. That contrast poetic vision chained to practical fragility is crucial to understanding him. Tesla cultivated a public persona as deliberately as he designed coils. He understood optics. He wore fine clothes. He dined at Delmonico's and allowed the cameras into his carefully lit demonstrations. That theater did two things. It attracted money, and it set expectations. A wealthy patron wants spectacle and a story. Tesla sold both. Sometimes that transaction was healthy. Press attention led to financing that produced working inventions. Other times it was poisonous. Announcements of future marvels invited scrutiny. The experiments could not survive. His private life looked stranger when you stepped behind the curtain. He suffered behaviors that modern clinicians would label obsessive, rituals that constrained him, phobias that limited his world. He spoke of visions and flashes with a certainty that blurred into delusion for some observers. In late years, he reported auditory and visual phenomena that made coherent, sustained work difficult. Those conditions were not moral failings. They were human limitations with concrete effects on productivity, reliability, and relationships. The arc of his career is best seen as two distinct phases. From roughly 1885 to 1900, Tesla was a productive and influential engineer. He moved from laboratory prototypes to systems that could be scaled. He collaborated with, and in some cases equipped, the companies that wired an industrial age. After about 1900, the record changes. Publicity increases while demonstrable outputs dwindle. The notebooks of this later period are littered with grand designs, some inspiring, some incoherent, and far fewer repeatable blueprints. The pattern is visible in letters, lab notes, and the ledgers of disappointed funders. That decline did not erase his earlier achievements. It complicated them. A man who delivers a world-changing motor still can fall into exaggerated promises. The tragedy is not that Tesla failed to be a saint. The tragedy is that a talented engineer became increasingly isolated inside his own cognitive styles and public persona. He fought for patrons, courted the press, and chased rarer and rarer applause. When results did not follow, he doubled down on rhetoric. Equally important is how a few episodes of mismanagement and overreach were amplified by later storytellers. Wardenclyffe, the unfinished tower on Long Island, is a symbol that works differently depending on the lens. For the press at the time, it was headline copy. For engineers, it was an experiment built on assumptions that contemporary physics and mathematics judged questionable. For later mythmakers, it became a proof of suppression. Look at the archival cables between Tesla and his financiers, and you find practical disagreements, milestone misses, budget overruns, and strategic misalignment more than evidence of conspiratorial theft. Those are humdrum reasons for project failure. they are also less satisfying as myth. This is not to absolve Tesla of responsibility where responsibility is due. He misrepresented time. He was a real person, a gifted inventor whose early, verifiable contributions to electrical engineering were substantial, followed by years in which personal compulsions, public performance, and theoretical flights outpaced reproducible work. The result is a man whose legacy is split genuine technical achievement on one side, speculative rhetoric on the other, and a cautionary tale about the dangers of conflating spectacle with evidence. If you think of Tesla as a success story cut short, that is understandable. If you think of him as the archetypal persecuted genius, you are living inside a narrative that selects facts to serve a comforting moral. A more honest version resists comfort. It keeps the achievements and it names the failures. It asks us to admire the ingenuity while not losing the ability to ask for proof. But that still leaves a difficult, live question. How did the public memory move from this messy, human complexity to the clean, useful myth that fuels so many modern agendas? The answer lies in the next act, and that act is still unfolding in our culture today. Tesla's image today is everywhere and, in many places, nowhere like the historical man. Walk through Belgrade and you will find statues, a museum, and a banknote official symbols that smooth rough edges into national pride. Walk onto the internet and you will find merch, memes, and videos that convert every unsourced claim into sacred proof. Those two landscapes, the official state ritual and the internet carnival, met and reinforced each other. What survives is a symbol more useful than the person it was carved from. Symbols are shorthand. They condense a life into an emblem. The solitary inventor, the glowing bulb, the destroyed tower. Those frames are irresistible. They make tidy arguments. They are also dangerous because they become templates for how people interpret evidence. Today, when an inventor shows a crude prototype and is dismissed by peer reviewers, someone will inevitably whisper, "They're the next Tesla." The whisper converts skepticism into persecution. It flips the burden of proof. That flip is the core of the modern problem. The pattern plays out across several arenas. In grassroots pseudoscience, free energy, inventors invoke Tesla almost ritualistically. Online forums recirculate a handful of historical lines: the lamp that glows without wires, the genius derided by industry, as if those lines were proof of systemic suppression. In popular education, dozens of videos and short documentaries present these episodes as settled facts, often without nuance or citation. In business, entrepreneurs who pitch radical tech borrow the Tesla myth to bolster their credibility. A founder wants the martyr cred that makes risky bets feel heroic. There are concrete consequences. Scientists and research teams encounter misplaced assumptions in grant meetings and public outreach. Energy researchers are asked, earnestly, why they aren't implementing free energy systems already invented a century ago. Public interest in forbidden technologies redirects attention and sometimes dollars toward dead ends. Policy conversations become clogged by questions that assume a different truth, that transformative technologies were already created and then hidden. That assumption is not only false, it channels resources away from the incremental, costly, and necessary work that drives real advances. Cultural forces magnify this effect. Cold War-era nation-building in Yugoslavia turned Tesla into a national icon, part of a repertoire of prestige used by states to claim cultural and scientific legitimacy. In the United States and Europe, the 1960s counterculture rediscovered him and recast his eccentric pronouncements as evidence of suppressed enlightenment. The internet then accelerated the diffusion. A viral thumbnail can do the work of an edited book. Algorithms reward memorable narratives and images. Sensational claims spread faster than careful corrections. Once the story reaches velocity, communities form around it. Correction becomes a form of dishonor, evidence that the critic is complicit in the suppression. Visuals matter here. A glossy video of Tesla holding a glowing bulb will travel far further than a careful paper in an engineering journal. A statue in a public square encodes a political decision that simplifies nuance into pride. A car company naming itself after Tesla appropriates authority with a logo. Each instance is a small amplifier. The myth leaches into branding, into civic symbolism, into doorstop history taught in schools. There are also subtler effects on how we think about technological authorship. The lone genius story suppresses the reality that most innovation is cumulative. It erases the dozens, sometimes hundreds, of engineers and technicians who iterate, standardize, and industrialize. That erasure shapes young people's imaginations. It creates a false model for aspiring inventors. If you are dismissed, claim persecution and become a myth. If you are successful, narrate your success as destiny rather than team effort. Either way, the culture of invention becomes romantically distorted. The myth also provides rhetorical shelter for those resisting expertise. Rejection by specialists, the very mechanism of quality control in science and engineering, becomes reframed as evidence of corruption. That rhetorical move has real-world risks. When public health, climate science, or telecommunications policy face such reframing, the consequence is confusion and lower trust. People prefer stories where truth is simple and villains are clear. The Tesla myth supplies that economy. It is, therefore, politically useful to different groups who want an uncomplicated moral narrative. Still, not everything built on Tesla's name is harmful. Museums and serious biographies have revived interest in electrical history. The name can inspire curiosity. The problem comes when inspiration becomes evidence. The difference between invoking Tesla to inspire and invoking Tesla to overturn peer review is the difference between education and delusion. If you have watched the shiniest Tesla videos on YouTube, you have seen the phenomenon in microcosm: quick edits, dramatic music, selective quotes. If you then search for critical historical work, you might find dense scholarship that does not travel as well. The result is a cultural environment in which myth outcompetes nuance. That imbalance matters for what we fund, what we teach, and how we judge claims that could change lives. What makes the Tesla effect particularly insidious is its adaptability. Nationalists, tech founders, countercultural movements, and conspiracy theorists all find uses for the same simplified story. Each group polishes a different facet: martyr, ancestor, prophet, and each sells that polished image as truth. The different uses insulate each other. When a film dramatizes Tesla as a persecuted genius, it lends cultural plausibility to an online conspiracist's claim. When a startup takes the name, it lends commercial glamour. The story grows a network of mutually reinforcing nodes. So what do we lose when myth outcompetes history? We lose an accurate intellectual toolkit. We trade the slow, collaborative work of science for a rhetoric of revelation. We invite cynicism about institutions and place faith in solitary vision. That trade-off has costs in research funding, public trust, and the kinds of education we provide young engineers. This is not merely an academic worry. It shows up in a small way and a large one. Small, in comment threads where engineers are mocked for insisting on reproducible data. Large, in the casual way entire policy debates assume a sleight of hand that never happened. When people ask why wireless power wasn't given to us, they are repeating a story that substitutes moral outrage for technical explanation. The physics that governs electromagnetic waves and power dissipation does not care about narratives. The myth carries an emotional appeal, and therefore a resilience, that facts alone struggle to match. That resilience is why the correction is slow. But correction is possible. It requires stories that are as compelling as the myths, stories that accept complexity, celebrate incremental labor, and hold spectacle to account. The honest story of Tesla, the one that admires and scrutinizes, can be made cinematic. It will not be as tidy. It must be fresher for that. If the fabric of our present confidence in technology can be reshaped by the half-truths about a single inventor, then the question becomes urgent. Which other shortcuts are we walking on?